In February 2017, Team Cherry released Hollow Knight, redefining the Metroidvania genre. Over 7 years later, there's still no sign of its sequel, Hollow Knight Silksong. The Hollow Knight fanbase is ravenous for any information about the game, but Team Cherry has shrouded itself in silence. The hype for Silksong is so massive that every gaming event is spammed by the Hollow Knight fanbase, demanding an update on its development. At Gamescom 2024 Opening Night Live, the most anticipated game wasn't Black Ops 6, Borderlands 4 or Indiana Jones. No, host Geoff Keighley was forced to send out a tweet warning Hollow Knight fans to not get their hopes up because Silksong would not be at the show. Some fans are angry at Team Cherry's silence. Others have lost hope, believing that the game will never come out. Most are simply disappointed. Why is the development of Silksong taking so long? And why is Team Cherry refusing to say anything about it? Well, in this video I'll explain why the overwhelming success of Hollow Knight might very well be the reason behind both Silksong's delays and Team Cherry's silence, and that the situation Team Cherry finds themselves in is a lot more common than you might think. But if we want to understand why Silksong hasn't been released yet, we first need to take a look back at Hollow Knight. More specifically, the way Team Cherry developed Hollow Knight gives us a lot of clues about how the development of Silksong might be going. So, the development of Hollow Knight started in 2013. Artist Ari Gibson and designer William Pellon developed a game for a game jam called Hungry Knight. Hungry Knight wasn't very good, but it inspired them to create a game that takes place underground, planting a seed that would eventually grow into the kingdom of Hallow Nest. But making a game requires money. So the Australian duo started a Kickstarter campaign in late 2014, asking for a modest 35,000 Australian dollars. The campaign raised more than $57,000 from over 2,000 backers and reached about half of the project's stretch goals. Hollow Knight's Kickstarter was a success, but not an overwhelming one. Despite the relatively low asking price, the game was funded with only a few days of the campaign remaining. Rather underwhelming in hindsight, considering Hollow Knight's status today. Nevertheless, Team Cherry now had the funds to make Hollow Knight a reality. Thanks to the Kickstarter, Ari and William were able to hire David Kazi, who would serve as the team's technical director. 2 independent contractors were also brought on board. Composer Christopher Larkin would provide Hollow Knight's soundtrack, while Matthew Leth Griffin would be handling PR and marketing. As is often the case in game development, things did not go according to plan. Team Cherry had originally set out to make a 10-hour game in 1 year, with a projected launch in mid-2015. But Hollow Knight had ballooned so much in scope that it would end up becoming one of the biggest Metroidvanias ever released. As Hollow Knight grew, the team was forced to delay the game several times. The unexpected extra development time meant that Team Cherry had to look for additional funding to finish their game. For example, they received help from the Indie Fund, a group of successful indie developers who fund projects to help them get over the finish line. Thanks to the extra money, the team was able to polish the game enough for a Steam release in February 2017. But here too, not everything went smoothly. Despite it being a 2D game, Hollow Knight suffered from performance issues, causing frustrating frame drops. The Mac and Linux versions, which were promised to launch alongside the Windows version, suffered a delay of almost 2 months. And the highly anticipated Wii U version, one of the Kickstarter's stretch goals, was cancelled entirely. A port would be developed for the brand new Nintendo Switch instead. Fortunately, these issues didn't impact the game's sales. Hollow Knight sold over 65,000 copies in its first month and reached the 100,000 mark by May. There are several reasons behind its initial success. For one, while games that fuse Metroidvania and Souls-like elements are a dime a dozen these days, this was a unique selling point back in 2017. Its distinctive art style also helped it stand out from the crowd. And Team Cherry decided to set Hollow Knight's price at a very affordable $15, a steal for a game with so many hours of high quality content. So, Hollow Knight was a hit, and Team Cherry had enough money to work on several expansions, which they would release for free. but it was still far from becoming one of the best-selling indie games ever made, with many gamers even being completely unaware of the game's existence. This was partly because Hollow Knight launched as a PC exclusive. Additionally, Team Cherry decided to release their game at the worst possible time, just 1 week before the release of the Nintendo Switch, along with the first 3D Zelda game in 6 years. There's a reason why Team Cherry chose this unfortunate date, which we'll get to later. As a result, major gaming outlets such as IGN and GameSpot did not review Hollow Knight at launch. They were too busy covering Nintendo's new console, and that hadn't changed at the end of the year. There's no mention of Hollow Knight in either publication's Best of 2017 lists. Still, despite facing stiff competition by the Switch at launch, Hollow Knight owes much of its current success to Nintendo. The Japanese publisher directly helped Team Cherry turn Hollow Knight into one of the best-selling indie games of all time. Let me explain. Nintendo had gone all out for the launch of its new console, with Breath of the Wild, Super Mario Odyssey and Mario Kart 8 Deluxe all releasing within the first 12 months of the Switch's life. But by 2018, that well had dried up. Nintendo had very little to show during the E3 Nintendo Direct that year. Its only major release of 2018 would be Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, which wouldn't come out until December. Nintendo desperately needed games to keep Switch owners busy until then. And because the Switch wasn't powerful enough to run most AAA games, Nintendo was forced to rely on indie games to fill the gap.
These are just a few of the terrific indie games you can play in the months ahead.
Enter Hollow Knight. Nintendo had taken notice of the game's success on PC. It decided to offer Team Cherry not only a prominent spot in the Direct itself,
venture through the mysterious subterranean landscapes of a vast, forgotten kingdom in Team Cherry's Hollow Knight,
but also an entire Nintendo Treehouse segment dedicated to Hollow Knight. Ari and William were invited to showcase their game live on air for about 17 minutes. And if that wasn't enough, Team Cherry managed to set up Hollow Knight as a shadow drop.
Is available on the Nintendo eShop starting today.
Switch owners were ecstatic. The console still lacked a proper Metroid title, as Nintendo had inexplicably decided to keep the first 2D Metroid game in 15 years, Metroid Samus Returns, exclusive to the old 3DS. And back in 2018, Metroid Dread was nothing more than vaporware. Combine that with Hollow Knight's low price point and you had a recipe for a breakout success. The Switch release exceeded Team Cherry's expectations. It had taken the game about 15 months to sell 1 million copies on PC, but just 2 weeks after its launch on the Nintendo eShop, the Switch version had already sold over 250,000 copies. It can't be understated how popular Hollow Knight is on Nintendo's console. Even today, over 6 years after its launch, Hollow Knight still ranks in the eShop's top-selling charts. Xbox and PlayStation ports would follow soon after, containing all 4 free expansions. With millions of copies sold, the future for Team Cherry was looking bright. Ari and William had just one thing left to do. In the very last hour of the Kickstarter campaign, backers had unlocked Hornet. Hornet was originally meant to release as a second playable character for Hollow Knight, but for a reason we'll get into later, Ari and William eventually decided to create a separate campaign around her. And in February 2019, Team Cherry announced that the Hornet campaign had grown so large in scope, they would turn it into a fully fledged sequel, Hollow Knight Silksong. For the second year in a row, the Team Cherry game was part of Nintendo's E3, with an extensive showcase of Silksong during the Treehouse livestream. This demo was also playable on the show floor. Team Cherry released 2 more blog posts that year, one just after E3 and one right before the holidays. And after that, silence. Team Cherry's last blog post was published in December 2019. Ari and William did give the occasional interview, such as one to Edge in late 2020 and to A Profound Waste of Time in 2021. Leth, the contractor responsible for PR and marketing, also appeared on several podcasts over the years, and occasionally confirms that yes, Team Cherry is in fact still working on Silksong. That leaves us with 2 big questions. Why is development taking so long, and why is Team Cherry staying quiet? Before we attempt to answer these questions, let's get one thing straight. I have no inside information on the development of Silksong, but based on Hollow Knight's development and the interviews Ari and William have given over the years, it seems pretty clear what is happening behind closed doors at Team Cherry. So, Hollow Knight's launch in early 2017 did not go smoothly, and the launch day Team Cherry picked could not have been worse. But, as I said before, there's a very good reason why Hollow Knight launched when it did. Team Cherry was dangerously close to running out of money. In an interview with the magazine A Profound Waste of Time, Ari says, "I remember on Hollow Knight, near the end of development, I was at a point where I could only sparingly purchase croissants." William, meanwhile, mentions he fed himself with tuna, rice and bags of leftover cured meat. Due to their dwindling finances, Team Cherry were unable to complete everything they had planned for Hollow Knight and were forced to make cuts. For example, the Deep Nest area was drastically reduced in size, and the Forest of Bones, also known as the Bone Forest, was completely cut. This was a difficult decision, according to Ari. Cutting it was tough at the time. It seemed so cool, but it was totally the right thing to do. William and I were already slammed with all of the other enormous areas to build, and they all would have suffered for Bone Forest's inclusion. These cuts were necessary for Team Cherry to be able to finish the game in an acceptable state, and before their bank accounts were completely empty. Team Cherry's precarious financial situation is further corroborated by an insider named Greg, who worked as Team Cherry's lead playtester on Hollow Knight. Back in 2018, Greg wrote on Discord that while developing Hollow Knight, Team Cherry literally ran out of money and released it as is. In 2020, he went even further, stating that Hollow Knight is a rushed game made on a shoestring budget. This would explain the performance issues and the delay of the Mac and Linux versions. With the benefit of hindsight, we now know that the cut content and rushed release did not harm Hollow Knight as a product. Quite the opposite. Hollow Knight ended up becoming a critical and commercial success. It's difficult to estimate how many copies Hollow Knight has sold, as Team Cherry hasn't shared any sales data since 2019. There are some online tools that can provide us with some rough estimates, based on public Steam data. Gamealytic estimates that Hollow Knight has sold around 8.7 million copies, and Steam Revenue Calculator estimates that it has grossed over $235 million. There is also something called the Boxlighter ratio, which multiplies the number of Steam reviews based on the game's release date, in an attempt to estimate how many copies it has sold. Hollow Knight has over 325,000 reviews and was released in 2017, so that results in around 13 million copies sold. Again, these methods are imprecise, so take them with a grain of salt. But when you consider that these estimates are just for the Steam version and combine them with Hollow Knight's enormous success on Switch, plus whatever copies were sold on Xbox and PlayStation, it's not unreasonable to say that Hollow Knight is one of the best-selling indie games ever made. That puts it in a very exclusive list, with games like Hotline Miami, Undertale and Stardew Valley. These indie games were all incredibly successful, having outsold most AAA games, and were made by either a single developer or a tiny development team. But what they also have in common is that the developers of these titles all have trouble releasing their next game, and that's no coincidence. Allow me to explain. In a perfect world with infinite time and money, developers would be able to work on their game forever until they are 100% happy with their work. But we don't live in that world. We live in the cold, hard world of capitalism, where games have to turn a profit so that their developers can make a living. That is where producers come in. They need to make sure that all the years and money spent on development results in a video game that actually releases. In industry lingo, this is known as shipping a game. In the largest companies, both public and private, producers answer to shareholders. These shareholders want the companies they invest in to ship games so they can have a return on their investment. Smaller gaming companies may not have shareholders, but producers still have to make sure they secure funding from publishers or private investors. Often, these studios have to meet internal deadlines or milestones if they don't want to lose that funding. These milestones are meant to keep a project on track for release and make sure it doesn't get bogged down by delay after delay. The smallest indie teams don't tend to have publishers, but they also face financial pressure in the form of their dwindling savings accounts. So pretty much no developer can afford to keep working on a single project forever, because they need the income from a newly released game to keep paying themselves, their employees, and secure new funding for future projects. There are, however, two big exceptions to this rule. 1. A developer who invents a game concept so compelling that fans will gladly fund its development by spending thousands of dollars on virtual spaceships. Or 2. The solo developers or small teams who make a game so good that it enters the gaming mainstream and sells millions of copies as a result. Undertale sold at least 3.5 million copies on Steam alone. The first Hotline Miami sold at least 4 million copies on Steam alone. Stardew Valley has sold over 30 million copies. These developers are also all working on their next highly anticipated game. Undertale creator Toby Fox has been working on Deltarune since 2012. Hotline Miami developer Denetton Games is working on Sector X, but has not shared any new information since 2019. Stardew Valley creator Concerned Ape is developing Haunted Chocolatier, but its first and only trailer dates back to 2021. These developers have all made so much money with their games that they could easily retire. They don't, of course, because they love making games. But because there's no impetus for them to release their next game, they end up tinkering with their projects until they're completely happy with them. But that is a dangerous mindset to have as a game developer. In an interview with Vice, Bruce Straley, former co-director at Naughty Dog, explained this as a feeling innate to the job of developer. The reality is, left to our own devices, we as developers would never ship a game, because there's always something else to iterate on, or new ideas, or more polish to make the game better. It's always going to be never finished, just shipped. The most famous example of this phenomenon is Star Citizen, a game that has been in development since 2012. The project is helmed by Chris Roberts, famous for creating the Wing Commander series and Freelancer. He wanted to make a next-gen MMO space simulator, funded by his fans. With success, as Star Citizen has raised over $700 million through crowdfunding alone. But while the game is now playable, it is still in early access, with no release date in sight. Cloud Imperium Games, Robert's studio, is also developing a single-player spin-off at the same time, Squadron 42. Robert said this about Squadron 42's development progress back in 2018.
Well, Squadron 42, we're now sort of on the downhill ramp. We're 18 months away, looking like, from when we have to be ready to release it.
Turns out, Chris Roberts was a bit too optimistic. At CitizenCon 2024, his studio released a new trailer, promising a release in 2026. Yes, that's 6 years later than originally promised. To put this into context, Squadron 42's performances were recorded in 2016. And while Squadron 42 at least has some kind of release window, when Star Citizen's 1.0 version will come out is anyone's guess. Why is that? Well, after making Wing Commander, Chris Roberts started working on Strike Commander, a project that was delayed by over 2 years, with several complete reboots along the way. And while its development required over 1 million man-hours, very little of that work was able to be used in the final game. Same thing with Freelancer, developed by Robert's studio Digital Anvil. Freelancer was supposed to be developed in 2.5 years, with a release in fall of 2000. But the project soon ran into development issues. Digital Anvil had to delay the game because of its wildly ambitious promises, with the studio running out of money as a result. Freelancer managed to ship in early 2003, 2.5 years later than originally planned. Chris Roberts' projects almost never reached their original deadlines because he has a tendency to increase the scope of his project as development goes on.
We definitely did not have that on the initial Kickstarter or the pitches that we were doing.
Roberts said this himself in an interview with Ars Technica. Is Star Citizen today a bigger goal than I imagined in 2012? Absolutely. When the scope changes, the amount of time it will take to deliver all the features naturally increases. This is something we are acutely aware of. How do we balance the mutually conflicting wants of the community to have this hugely ambitious game, but not wait forever for it? Robert said this in 2015. And that brings us back to Silksong. Team Cherry develops their games in a similar way. Ari and Williams' preferred working method is what the Edge article describes as controlled scope creep. In the A Profound Waste of Time interview, Ari explains that ideas always produce more ideas. So the more you have that flexibility, let yourself be surprised by what's going to happen and keep your mind open, that's what ends up populating the world. And this is how Hornet evolved from an additional playable character into a full-blown sequel. As Hornet is taller than the Knight, the protagonist of Hollow Knight, she would feel too constrained in Hollow Knight's world of claustrophobic caves. So, Ari and William decided her adventure would take place in an entirely new space instead. But that meant not only designing a new moveset, as was the original plan, but also designing new levels, new enemies, and so on. Every seemingly tiny detail can end up having a big impact on Silksong's development. For example, while the Knight is a silent protagonist, Hornet has a distinct personality. In Hollow Knight, she voices her feelings, so she needs to be voiced and be able to ask questions in Silksong. This seemingly small detail completely upends how Silksong's story is told and the world is presented compared to the original Hollow Knight. This approach of controlled scope creep is what turned Hollow Knight from a short 10-hour-long Metroidvania into the modern classic that it is today. But it might also very well be why Silksong is taking so long to make. Leth himself has acknowledged this. In an episode of the Indie Gamer podcast a few years ago, he explained how Team Cherry struggles with managing the scope of Silksong and that they sometimes don't know when to stop.
I try to get them to create a wish list, so to speak. Whenever you have a new idea, put that on the wish list. And sometimes if it's like really good, but it's going to be a ton of work, maybe put that for the sequel wish list, like
yes.
push it aside
Yep.
and understand you don't have to put that in the game for it to be great. Just don't go too crazy. And I mean, I get on a call with them periodically. Like most of the time it's just so everyone can update what they've been doing. But then they'll still just start going crazy, like going off on an idea. And I'm like, wow, I love hearing it because that's the fun part of the creative process. But It's also kind of like, we haven't figured that out yet, or are we just going to keep adding stuff?
Yeah, absolutely.
This continuous scope creep could explain why Silksong still isn't out yet. Now, I already know what your next question is. It's fine that Team Cherry takes as long as they need to make Silksong, but if they need more time, why don't they simply say so? Why are they refusing to talk to their community? Well, for one, it's hard to commit to a release date when your game keeps growing in scope and features. Fans weren't happy when previous tentative release dates didn't come true. And in the age of social media, the voices of unhappy fans are louder than ever. Just ask George R.R. Martin, the creator of the A Song of Ice and Fire series, the basis for HBO's blockbuster TV show Game of Thrones. Believe it or not, Martin and Team Cherry are both in the same boat. You see, A Song of Ice and Fire fans are desperately awaiting the release of the highly anticipated 6th book in the series, The Winds of Winter. Martin has been working on The Winds of Winter for at least a decade, but there's still no release date in sight. The writer has explained many times why he no longer predicts when the book will finally come out. I've given up making predictions, because people press me, when is it going to be done? And I make what I think is the best case estimate, and then stuff happens. Then everybody gets mad that I lied. I've never lied about these predictions, they're the best I can make. Now, you might think, we don't need Team Cherry to tell us about their progress or share a release date. We just want to know what they're up to, an occasional sign of life, even if it has nothing to do with Silksong. Well, according to Martin, everything he shares online, even about completely unrelated topics, leads to the same behavior by a certain share of his fans. I say, Happy Thanksgiving, and they say, never mind Happy Thanksgiving, where's the book? I love the fans, although I do think Twitter and the internet and social media has brought out a viciousness I never saw in the old days. Love and hate are very close, particularly with something like comic books or any established franchises. And there's more, because A Song of Ice and Fire fans don't just want Winds of Winter to come out. They want it to be the best one yet. Here too, the similarities with Silksong are too large to ignore. Because when Silksong was announced, expectations were already very high due to the quality of Hollow Knight. But fans have been waiting for Team Cherry's next project for 5 years and counting, and their expectations have steadily risen over the years. Because of Silksong's long development time, everyone expects it to be a bigger, better game than Hollow Knight, already one of the best Metroidvanias ever released. But let me ask you this, is it reasonable to put so much pressure on a 3-person studio? Are these expectations even realistic at all? Because there is a distinct possibility that not everyone will be happy with Silksong when it comes out. And when a product does not meet the expectations of its fanbase, the consequences for its creators can be devastating. Just ask the developers of Hotline Miami.
It was horrible. Yeah, it was horrible.
Hotline Miami's blend of ultra-violent, fast-paced gameplay, brutal difficulty and hypnotizing visuals took the gaming world by surprise back in 2012, becoming one of the very first breakout indie successes. Its legacy can still be seen today. Hotline Miami likes now represent an entire subgenre in their own right. Hotline Miami also proved that you don't need a big studio to make a great game, inspiring many to become indie developers themselves. 3 years later, Dennaton, consisting of programmer Jonathan Söderström and artist Dennis Wedin, released a follow-up, Hotline Miami 2 Wrong Number. The duo attempted to make a bigger, better, harder sequel and mostly succeeded. But the game wasn't without its flaws, resulting in a decidedly more mixed critical reception. Dennaton have said they could live with the divided reviews from critics. It was the toxicity from the Hotline Miami fanbase that truly affected them. In a no-clip documentary on the Hotline Miami series, Dennis explains how he felt after launching Hotline Miami 2.
It was horrible. Yeah, it was horrible. I think we were both quite surprised because we were very happy with the game, and at least I felt like if people enjoyed the first game, they would love this game. But that was not the case, sadly.
As an unknown studio, they mostly received constructive criticism from fans for Hotline Miami 1. There was no hype for the original, because Hotline Miami came out of nowhere and it was Dennaton's very first game. But when Hotline Miami 2 launched, Dennaton had become one of the most popular indie studios around. The fanbase felt that Dennaton had failed to meet their expectations for the sequel to their beloved Hotline Miami and reacted with harassment and death threats.
Now it's just like, this is a horrible game, I hope you all die, you suck, and a bunch of like swear words and worse things than that.
The toxicity was so bad that Dennis completely left the Hotline Miami community. Luckily, Dennis and Jonathan were able to find fun in game development again and are currently working on Sector X. But they are approaching the process differently now, by keeping communication with fans to an absolute minimum.
Which is kind of sad, because it was kind of cool to hang out with the people who play your games. But yeah, it's quite different now.
With this in mind, put yourself in the shoes of Ari and William, working on a game so popular that every gaming event, no matter how big, is bombarded with thousands of your fans asking where the hell your next game is. Is there really a way for Team Cherry to deal with the overwhelming pressure and expectations of fans and to not engage with them at all? Besides, their silence is not absolute. We know the most important piece of information about Silksong. Team Cherry is still working on it. Even though they could have retired after releasing Hollow Knight, Ari and William have not done so, because they love making games. Just like Hollow Knight, Silksong is a passion project first and a commercial product second. So, one thing is for certain, Silksong will come out. When? Nobody knows. As Geoff Keighley said, Team Cherry is still cooking, so let's let them cook.